A Danish designer once said that every object in a home is either earning its place or taking up space that something better could use. It sounds like a design principle, and it is. But it is also just the way most Nordic households actually think about what lives in their rooms. Not as a philosophy they consciously apply, but as a quiet, ongoing question that most objects in a Nordic home have already had to answer. 9 specific things that consistently don't make the cut, and the thinking behind each one. Before we continue, if you'd consider subscribing, it only takes a few seconds and helps the channel out a lot. Now back to the video. So let's start with the bedroom, and the specific object that Nordic households have been removing from it long before anyone wrote an article telling them to. The phone on the bedside table. A bedroom in a Nordic home tends to be used for sleeping, not for the final 20 minutes of screen time before sleep and the first 5 minutes of screen time before getting up. The phone, if it is charged in the bedroom at all, is typically on the other side of the room rather than within arm's reach of the pillow. Sleep research covered in the Bedtime Habits video on this channel has consistently found that people who don't have phones within reach at night fall asleep faster, sleep more deeply, and report higher morning energy. The Nordic household didn't need the study. It had already arrived at the same conclusion through a different route, which is that the bedroom is the room for sleep, and anything that competes with sleep doesn't belong in it. Moving to the second thing, and this one lives in the living room in a way that Nordic households find quietly exhausting to look at. A television as the focal point of the main living space. This is not a video that argues against television. It is a video about where it lives and what that does to the room. In a Nordic living room, the sofa and chairs are typically arranged around a conversation rather than around a screen, which means the room can function as a social space even when nothing is being watched. An American living room arranged entirely around a large television is a room with one primary purpose, and a screen as its visual anchor. A Nordic living room tends to feel different because the architecture of the space was not designed to point everyone in the direction of the same glowing rectangle. The television, when present, is there. It is not the answer to the question of what the room is for. There is a specific experience that a living room arranged around conversation rather than a screen produces. Worth naming because it is difficult to appreciate without having spent time in one. When you sit down in a room with no dominant focal point, pulling everyone's attention in one direction, the default activity becomes talking, reading, or simply being in the same space as other people without needing to organize it around something to watch. This sounds unremarkable until you notice how rarely it happens in homes where the television has already answered the question of what everyone does when they sit down together. For the third thing, and this one is about the hallway, the first space anyone enters when they come through the front door. Anything that doesn't belong to the function of arriving and leaving. A Nordic hallway is a machine for transition, hooks for coats, a rack for shoes, perhaps a small bench for putting them on. That is close to the complete inventory. It is not a secondary storage room, not a place for the things that didn't find a home elsewhere, not a display space for objects that are meant to create an impression as guests walk in. The hallway does one job and is designed to do that job efficiently, which means everything that isn't coat, shoe, or key has to make a case for itself that most things fail to make. The fourth thing is one that lives on kitchen surfaces in most homes, but disappears from Nordic ones fairly quickly. The collection of appliances that are used occasionally but live on the counter permanently. A Nordic kitchen counter tends to hold what gets used daily and store what gets used sometimes. The toaster that comes out on weekend mornings and goes back in the cupboard. The blender that has a defined home in a cabinet rather than a permanent position on the counter. The coffee maker that earns its counter space through daily use, and nothing beside it. The specific logic behind this is not minimalism for its own sake, but the relationship between visual clutter and mental load, covered in research on household environments. A counter with 6 objects on it is a counter that has to be visually processed and navigated every time anyone uses that kitchen. A counter with 2 objects on it is simply a surface. Point 5 is the one that tends to produce the most recognition, because it is hiding in plain sight in almost every home that has never thought to look at it. The guest bathroom that has become a staging area for products nobody uses regularly enough to put in the main bathroom, but nobody has decided to throw away. Expired sunscreen from 3 summers ago. Sample-size shampoos from hotel stays. A hairdryer for guests to use that is also used by nobody in the household. A Nordic household tends to treat the guest bathroom with the same criteria as any other room. Does what is in here have a reason to be here? And is that reason still current? The logic isn't ruthless. It is simply honest, applied consistently rather than only during a dedicated clear-out that happens every few years. The 6th thing requires a moment of honest self-assessment for most people, because it is uncomfortable to name. Decorative objects that have been in the same position for so long that nobody in the household actually sees them anymore. A ceramic bowl on a shelf that was placed there in 2019 and has not been moved since is not decorating the room, it is occupying the room. Nordic home culture tends toward a smaller number of objects that are actually noticed, actually liked, and actually contributing something to the quality of the space, rather than a larger number that have become invisible through familiarity. The test a Nordic household applies to a decorative object is not whether it was worth buying at some point, but whether, if it were removed today, anyone would notice its absence. Objects that fail that test tend not to survive the next clear-out. The specific thing worth saying about Nordic home aesthetics is that they are not cold. A Nordic living room in winter with a lamp lit, a candle on the table, and a few carefully chosen objects is a room with real warmth and character. What it doesn't have is visual noise, and the absence of that noise is itself a form of presence. A room where every object was chosen tends to feel different from a room where objects accumulated. The quality of attention that went into the selection shows in the result, even to people who couldn't say exactly why the room feels the way it does. For the 7th thing, and this connects to the children's spaces in a Nordic home in a specific way that surprises parents from cultures with different defaults. An overwhelming quantity of toys with no organizational logic. Nordic children typically have toys, often very good ones, built to last and worth playing with. What Nordic children's rooms tend not to have is a volume of toys that exceeds what can be reasonably organized, accessed, and actually played with. The research on children and toys consistently finds that fewer, higher-quality toys produce more focused, creative, and sustained play than a large quantity of options that produces its own kind of overwhelm. A Nordic household applies to a child's room the same logic it applies to the rest of the house. More is not better if more means the useful things are buried under the things that aren't. The 8th thing is something most people recognize when it is named but rarely act on. Furniture that doesn't fit the room it's in, kept because getting rid of it seems like more effort than keeping it. A sofa that is too large for the living room, making the space feel cramped rather than comfortable. A bed frame that takes up so much floor space that the room can only be navigated in one direction. A dining table that seats 8 in a home, where 2 people live and guests come 4 times a year. Nordic households tend to evaluate furniture by how it fits the life being lived, rather than by how useful it might hypothetically be in a different life, and the specific willingness to let go of furniture that is actively making a room worse is one of the clearest expressions of the underlying logic that runs through everything on this list. And for the 9th and final thing, the one that connects all the others into a single observation. The object that is kept not because it is useful or beautiful, but because getting rid of it feels like a decision that needs to be made later. Every home has a version of this category. The thing that is too good to throw away but not good enough to use. The item with sentimental associations but no clear home. The object that has been in the same corner for so long that it has effectively become part of the architecture. A Nordic household tends to make the decision rather than defer it, not because Scandinavians are more decisive by nature, but because the cultural premise they are operating from is that an unmade decision about an object is itself a form of clutter, occupying not just physical space but mental space every time it is walked past. The decision, when it is finally made, is almost always the same one. It was always going to leave. The only question was when. 9 things. and the single thread running through all of them that is worth sitting with. A Nordic home is not empty, it is not cold or austere or lacking in warmth. It is simply a home where each thing in it was asked whether it belonged, and only the ones with a good answer stayed. The question itself is simple enough to apply anywhere, to any room, starting tonight. Not as a project, not as a decluttering challenge, but simply as a question, asked honestly of one thing at a time, with the willingness to hear the answer when the object gives it. A home that has been asked that question, over time and without urgency, ends up feeling like a place that was chosen rather than accumulated. That distinction, between a chosen home and an accumulated one, is what this entire list has been pointing at. Sit with that for a moment. I'll see you in the next one.